Chapter 20 of The Heart of Philura by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20 At the Parsonage. The solemn rush of the wind in the evergreens came soothingly through the open windows of the minister's study, where Mrs. Pettibone, arrayed in dust cap and apron, was once more guiltily busy in a surreptitious but no less searching and drastic eradication of dust and debris. Mr. Pettibone had denied himself excursions to Boston of late, that he might cultivate the parsonage vegetable garden; and in his visitations to the sick and sinful of his parish he had quite properly insisted upon his wife's company. " You're looking tired, my dear," he said kindly. " You need the fresh air and quiet of these country drives." But on this particular Saturday morning, when he had been unexpectedly called to leave his unfinished sermon for a funeral some miles distant, she had declined to accompany him. Mrs. Wessells, she explained, had asked leave to wash of a Saturday this week. The minister frowned. " That woman is always in the way," he said, with entire injustice. " Why not let her wash if she wants to, and you come with me? It's a lovely day. We'll take our lunch, eat it on the way, and be home in time for supper." She shook her head, with the gentle stubbornness he was beginning to know. The prospect of a combined picnic and funeral, unique though it was, did not blind her to the advantage of a long day in which to work her will upon the parsonage unhampered by his presence. He kissed her good bye hastily at last, then spoke words of strong encouragement and exhortation to the protesting old horse, who was, it appeared, perfectly aware of the day of the week and the illegal nature of a proceeding which had removed him from a leisurely rumination of hay and equine thoughts during a morning sacred to leisure. At the moment of his departure the gate clicked to admit the figure of Mrs. Wessells, unnaturally bulky in her wash-day attire, concealed from the public eye by a voluminous skirt of rusty black. Mrs. Wessells was found to be overflowing with explanations and apologies as she removed the outer layers of her costume. " 'S I says to Wessells, Mis' Pettibone won't mind, I says. It's all one to her whether I come a Sat'day or a Monday. There's always dirty clothes in the parsonage to be washed, I says. Not that your wash is any dirtier than other folks', but go where you will in this 'ere world, you're sure to find dirt to be swept and clothes to be washed. Now ain't that so? An' the Methodist picnic comes a Tuesday this year, so I promised the children I'd wash their clothes on a Monday so's they can go. Yes, Mrs. Pettibone, the children go to your Sunday school mornings at 9:30 and the Methodist Sunday school at 12 o'clock, and when I can get 'em started, to the Baptist Sunday school at 4 p.m. Yes, I want 'em to be able to judge fair and square as to which religion's best. Georgie, he likes the Methodist. There's something kind o' hearty and free and easy to the Methodist church, Georgie says, and Marie Isabel likes your church best, so I guess Marie'll be a Presbyterian, all right. She says she ain't got no special reason, and I guess 'twould be hard to find one, as I tell her pa. But he says, let her be, Ma. We won't stand in her way, he says. Wessells is real interested in religion, for all he ain't darkened the doors of a church in 15 years. Wessells favors the Baptists. He says it stands to reason a body 'at lived wicked ought to be put right in under the water when it comes to baptizing 'em. But the children's all been sprinkled already. That ought to do some good, I says, 'special when they're little and ain't got much hair. But M'randy, she took a notion all by herself when she was about 12 to be Episcopal. I thought I should die. M'randy Wessells, I says, there ain't none of our folks, nor your pa's either, ever been 'Piscopals, and what in under the canopy you want off them, I says. The 'Piscopals is stylish, Ma, she says, and they pernounce their words so nice, and the prayers is all wrote out, she says, so you know beforehand just how long they're going to be. So M'randy, she's Episcopal. I don't know there's anything really wrong in it. But I'm going to do up her white dress so she can go to the Methodist picnic a Tuesday on with the other children. Georgie, He says he's lookin' to save Mirandy yet, like a brand plucked from the burnin'. He learned that at the Methodist Sunday School. An' the way he gits it off, with Mirandy turnin' up her nose at him, makes me think he ought to be a preacher b' rights. Wessels, he says Georgie c'n be a local just as well as not, an' if he starts in when he's 10, he c'n be a prodigy. He's 8 now, my Georgie is, an' if he ain't cut out to be a prodigy, I don't know who is. Well, I guess I'd better knock on wood along o' that. It's a lot safer when you've gone and bragged that away about your children. It might save 'em from goodness knows what. It was when Mrs. Pettibone had succeeded at length in stemming the tide of this Jordan that she found the rush of the wind in the evergreens so exquisitely soothing. Other sounds reached her from afar, an intermittent rattle and creak of wagon wheels, the shouts of children at play, a soulless performance on the patent piano player across the street, the discordant quarrelling of sparrows about the eaves, and from the kitchen, happily distant, the voice of Mrs. Wessells, upraised in tuneful exhortation, timed to a deliberate rubbing of the minister's wristbands on the corrugated surface of the washboard. Pull for the shore, sailor, pull for the shore. Philura Pettibone endeavoured conscientiously to keep her thoughts from hovering about the photograph, hidden from view between the leaves of the inky blotter on her husband's writing table. But as she dusted the minister's commentaries and theologies in due sequence of their picturesque but no less disturbing disorder, her blue eyes wandered thither at lessening intervals. She wondered vaguely why he had not chosen to protect it by a frame and set it atop his table in plain view. She would have liked, she hoped, to see it there. She might even have ventured to speak of it to him. But its concealment suggested a secret, unassuaged grief, not to be shared with another, not even, nay, rather more particularly not, with herself. She pictured his face as it must have looked when he placed the photograph in its secure, as he no doubt supposed, hiding-place. For another to have seen it, even by accident, was like pushing aside, without sanctifying unction of sacred oil, the shielding veil from before the Holy of Holies. After a little she ventured to dust the blotter, her fingers light and hesitating, as one might touch the dead. His half-written sermon lay open to her view. She stooped and read, "Then, too, the memory of those who have outstripped us in the race, passing into the life more abundant, cheers us in our unending struggle after goodness and purity and truth. We could not indeed bear to think often of those lost angel faces, were we not faithful to the vision which is vouchsafed to us at intervals, like spaces of sunlit blue glimpsed through riven cloud." She thought he must have looked at the picture before writing those words. Perhaps his lips, which had kissed hers so carelessly at the moment of parting, had pressed that exquisite pictured mouth with its half-smiling, wholly wistful curve. The minister had shut himself into his study for more than an hour that morning before starting for his distant appointment. She fancied him pale and graver than his wont when he finally emerged in answer to her summons. Then a sudden distressful wonder fell upon her. Was the picture still there, or had he taken it away with him, folded close against his heart in the breast pocket of his best preaching coat? Her fingers trembled in their swift search. She drew a deep breath of relief. The picture was in its place. She wished passionately that he would have it copied large and hung upon the wall, like the crayon portrait of the first Mrs. Gus Bogart. But how could she bear the searching gaze of those dark eyes, more particularly when engaged, as at present, in an overt act of disobedience? She felt sure that the first Mrs. Pettibone would never sweep and dust the study in defiance of his wishes, nor indeed any room in the parsonage. Mary Pettibone was not, she reminded herself, that kind of a woman. Somebody, she thought it was Mrs. Deacon Scrimger, had once said in her hearing that the minister's wife was a slack housekeeper. There had been a hired girl in the parsonage in those days, who even, it was whispered, made the bed the minister's wife slept in till 10 o'clock of a morning. She took the picture from its hiding-place and stared at it hungrily. Then, quite deliberately, as one who has cast silly scruples to the wind, she crossed the room to the little mirror with its cheap mockery of sconce and candles. The mirror was a wedding gift from her Sunday school class. She had put it there herself, so that the minister might set his necktie straight and push back the unruly lock from his forehead the last thing of a Sunday morning. The mirror told no comforting lies. It gave back to the second Mrs. Pettibone a small, pale face, its forehead faintly lined beneath silvered waves of abundant hair, blue eyes under vaguely marked brows, and a mouth with little beauty of curve or sensuous colour. Feature by feature she compared it with the faded loveliness of the photograph. " You've no right to expect much," she told herself relentlessly. " You are only to piece out with. Didn't you know that? Yes, you did know it. You ought to be thankful for the chance to work for him, to cook his food and mend his clothes, yes, and clean his study so that he won't know it has been cleaned." So absorbed was the second Mrs. Pettibone in these bittersweet reflections that she did not hear Mrs. Wessells' trampling footsteps in the passage. But she started violently at the sound of that philosophical lady's voice at the door. " Well, I declare, you must be gettin' deef. I heard the door bell ring a couple o' times, an' thinks I, whatever can Mrs. Pettibone be doin' not to hear that bell? An' at last I come myself. It's a lady to see you, Mum. I put her in the parlour. My! Ain't this room a sight, with the books an' all? I'll whirl in an' finish puttin' it to rights, if you say so. You don't want I should? All right. But there ain't anybody knows how to do for him better than I do, havin' worked here constant since his first wife died. Yes, I put the company in the parlour." Mrs. Wessells came quite inside and closed the door behind her. " It's a young lady from the old Eggleston place," she said confidentially. " I washed up there a couple o' times before Milly Orne come to work for 'em. Land! You ain't never seen such clothes, all lace an' embroidery, fussed up to beat the band. My, yes, I knowed her the minute I opened the door. She's in the parlour, a settin' in the plush cheer by the window." Mrs. Pettibone slipped the photograph inside her blouse as she crossed the hall. Mrs. Wessells still lingered, her lean head craned forward on its long neck, with the obvious intent of witnessing the meeting between the two women. The girl was sitting very straight and still on the edge of her chair. Mrs. Pettibone, in the act of closing the door quietly but firmly behind her, was startled by the look, at once eager and despairing, on her young face. " Perhaps you don't remember me? " the girl said as she rose. " I am — you saw me "" Oh, yes, I remember you very well," the minister's wife hastened to reassure her visitor. " You're Mrs. Walter Hill, from the farm. I'm very glad —"" You're mistaken. I am not Mrs. Walter Hill," the girl said, in a low, hard voice. She had thrown back her head with its heavy braids, and her eyes were defiant. " You're not " faltered Mrs. Pettibone, overcome by a sudden recollection of the older woman's words. " She has a delusion. She thinks another man is her husband." " Oh, I see what you're thinking. I suppose Mother told you I was insane. She's treated me as if she thought I was all along. I don't see why I'm not." " Won't you sit down? " Mrs. Pettibone suggested nervously. " We can talk better that way." Already she had forgotten the picture hidden in her blouse. " You will let me talk to you? The sewing woman — I don't know her name — said you would. She said you could help me." " Oh," murmured the minister's wife, moving her fingers uncertainly. " You must mean Malvina Bennett. She told me she was going to work for you." " I meant to drown myself, that day," the girl said, quite simply, and with as little concern as though she had mentioned a trip to the city. She did not appear to notice the other woman's start of fear and amazement. " I'd been to the edge of that pool often and often, and tried," she went on. " But somehow I couldn't. I suppose I kept hoping something would happen. But that morning I just knew nothing would. Life would go on, getting more and more unbearable, until So I ran all the way, meaning to jump in and have it over with before Mother found out I was gone. She'd watched me for months, night and day. But Walter didn't notice. I don't suppose he cared. I shouldn't in his place." " But, my dear, your husband "" I told you, Walter isn't my husband. He's my brother." She drew a deep, half suffocated breath, like that of an exhausted swimmer. " There! " she sighed. " I've told. You wouldn't have guessed, would you? Mother said no one would guess if Walter and I played our parts. But we couldn't play our parts so very well. But Mother — you see, she didn't believe me when I told her I was married. And so "" My dear," interrupted Mrs. Pettibone, trembling violently against the back of the haircloth sofa, " do you think you ought to tell me all this? Wouldn't your mother " She felt suddenly weak and ill, and her voice trailed off faintly into silence under the girl's black gaze. " Then it isn't true! " the girl broke out sharply. " That woman told me a lie because she was afraid. Everybody's told me lies." The inarticulate despair in her young voice struck hard against the older woman's pitiful cowardice. " Well, what did Malvina Bennett tell you about me? " faltered Mrs. Pettibone. " She said you knew how to find people who were lost. She said you found your husband that way, in the All Encircling Good. But it was a lie, and I've told you for nothing. Well," she looked down quietly at the floor, thinking perhaps of the dark peace of the pool by the rock. Philura Pettibone felt the sharp corner of the photograph prick her thin breast. It seemed to rouse her to a faint realisation of the tragedy under that still face. " It was not a lie," she said weakly. " It is true. But one forgets sometimes. I did, only this morning." After a little while she added with an effort, " I will do all I can to help you." The girl looked at her searchingly. " Do you mean that it's true — about the All Encircling Good? I don't know what that means, but I've said it over and over to myself, and somehow it made me feel I wanted to see you." Her voice was choked. " None of us can know what the All Encircling Good really is," Mrs. Pettibone said, in a low, hesitating voice. " It means God everywhere present, knowing all things." " I'm not religious," the girl said coldly. " I never liked church." She arose and drew her scarf about her shoulders. " I might have known it was only that. I wish I hadn't. Oh, put it down to my insanity." And she laughed aloud as she walked toward the door. Mrs. Pettibone stared at the girl aghast, her back rigid against the haircloth sofa, her hands seeking her heart instinctively. Again she felt the slight prick of the hidden picture. The girl, still smiling drearily to herself, was about to pass out. Mrs. Pettibone watched her fingers close upon the door knob, like one in a painful dream. Then all at once she sprang up, alert, alive. " You're not going," she cried, " until I've told you. What is it you want? " The girl turned with a queer, jerky movement of her head. " What do I want? " she repeated. " What do I want? Why should I tell you? " Mrs. Pettibone took the girl's limp hand and held it tightly, as if she feared to let go. " You must come back and sit by me on the sofa. I shall not let you go away without telling me." The girl sat down with the sullen acquiescence of a child accustomed to yield to a superior will. " You will tell me? " urged Mrs. Pettibone. The girl made no answer. Her eyes were set drearily upon the opposite wall, where hung a cheap copy of the Huguenot Lovers. " If you want anything — anything," the gentle voice went on, " it is yours already. It will come to you, whatever it is. Because — you wouldn't want it. You couldn't, if God didn't want you to have it. God is good. He loves you. He knows everything." She felt the girl's hand tremble violently within her own. " I want Stephen," she whispered. " I want him." And she burst into hard, racking sobs. " Stephen, Stephen," she moaned, " you didn't mean to leave me without a word. You couldn't." All at once she dried her eyes and sat up. " I'm going to tell you everything," she said. " I must. You will believe me." But she lapsed into silence, staring before her at the picture of the tall lover and the girl within his clasp. " Stephen looked something like that man in the picture," she said, after a long minute. " He was that much taller than me." Her lips fell apart like a child. " He did look something like that," she repeated wonderingly. And after a pause she added, " I had a photograph of him, but Mother found it and took it away. She said I ought to be ashamed. She said he was poor and common looking, and that I might have known " Mrs. Pettibone sat very still. Within her blouse she was conscious of the picture. She felt very much ashamed of herself, and the realisation forced hot blood upward into her face. The girl glanced at her uncertainly. " We were married," she said, " by a regular minister. But I didn't know the minister's name, and he didn't give me any paper. He said he would send it to Stephen afterward. But he went away, and so " Mrs. Pettibone sighed. She didn't know how to ask questions skilfully, but she felt that the girl needed help in telling her story. " You mean the minister went away," she suggested timidly, " and without giving you a certificate. That was very careless of him. But there should have been other papers. The license and the Bureau of Vital Statistics, surely "" No," the girl shook her head. " The minister didn't go away — not that I know of. I meant Stephen. He went West 2 weeks after we were married. He had an opening, and as soon as he made good — that's what he called it — he was going to send for me. But he didn't. I never heard from him. I'm afraid something happened." Two big tears escaped from her eyes and rolled swiftly down her haggard young face. " Sometimes I wish I was sure he is dead." " Oh, my dear! " protested Mrs. Pettibone. All the alertness and aliveness of which she had been so vividly conscious but a moment before seemed to have deserted her. " I'm sure I hope not," she added, gazing at the girl in a flutter of sympathy and alarm. " If he was dead," the girl went on gloomily, " I shouldn't be afraid of that other — of what Mother thinks. That's too horrible." Her voice had sunken almost to a whisper. " What does Mrs. Hill —" Mrs. Pettibone attempted to ask. The words seemed caught in her throat. The girl laughed harshly. " That's part of the play," she said. " Our name isn't Hill. But it makes no difference." " I'm afraid I don't understand," murmured the minister's wife. She was not, indeed, an astute woman. Perhaps the girl was insane. A little fear crept into her mind as she reflected that she was alone with this big, strong young woman. The girl stared at her from under gathered brows. Her eyes were hard once more. " If he's dead, I shall never hear from him. Perhaps Mother is right, after all. I oughtn't to have told." He isn't dead," said Mrs. Pettibone, without premeditation. She could have given no reason for the sudden strong conviction which surged up within her. " He isn't dead," she repeated. The girl drew a deep breath. " Then why doesn't he write to me? Why didn't he at first? You can see how terrible it was for me when I found — I didn't know when he went away. He didn't know. But when Mother — it was awful. She said I must take her to the minister's house, but I couldn't find it. We went one night to be married, quite suddenly. It was somewhere a good ways from our house. And I didn't notice. Then Mother said I'd been deceived. She said Stephen was a bad man. There are bad men like that, she said. She wondered why he left me at home. I told her it was only till he made good. And then she laughed. She laughed." " Have you written to him? " asked the minister's wife. " Only twice. Mother watched me, watched the mails. She said she would save me in spite of myself. She means to take me to Europe — afterwards. She thinks no one will know, and that I'll forget. She says I shall have my coming out party just the same." The girl sprang to her feet as if the small, low-ceilinged room stifled her. " I must go," she said. " If he is alive, you think "" Pray for him to come back to you," whispered Mrs. Pettibone, her small, childish face upturned to the girl's stately young height. " Pray and believe that he will come. Believe! It will bring him back to you from the uttermost parts of the earth." " He went West," the girl said vaguely. She was looking at the picture of the Huguenot lovers. " He couldn't be bad and look like that," she said, in a low, meditative voice. " He was good. I know he was good. I couldn't have loved him, could I, if he was what Mother said? " She walked slowly to the door. " Walter brought me," she said. " I asked Mother if I might go out to drive with Walter, and she was pleased. She wanted me to go before, but I wouldn't. She thought people ought to see us together, but we both hated it. Now Walter is kinder than at first. He said I might come in and talk to you — tell you, if it would make me feel any better." She opened the door. " I'm going to try," she said, looking back over her shoulder with a faint smile. " I think I shall pray every minute." " And believe," added Mrs. Pettibone. " You must expect him — soon." " Is that what you did? " the girl asked piteously. Mrs. Pettibone nodded and seemed unable to speak. " I shall try," the girl repeated humbly. " Pray and believe, pray and believe. I did believe, but it's hard now." Mrs. Pettibone watched her as she went slowly away. In front of the house was a low carriage. She saw the young man she had known as Walter Hill step out and help the girl to a seat within. Then the carriage rolled away down the street. When she turned to go in she found Mrs. Wessells standing behind her in the hall, her thin red arms akimbo, her eyes fixed upon the rapidly receding vehicle. " Well, now, I never! " murmured that astute lady. " He handed her in real nice, didn't he? For all I mistrusted he wasn't no great shakes of a husband when I was there to wash. He was out a careenin' 'round on that horse o' hisn most all the day, an' she a walkin' out in the yard all by her lonesome, an' Ma in law watchin' her out the window like a cat would a mouse. But I've seed men that a way before. They're queer critters, the best on 'em. Now ain't that so? I s'pose you ain't re'lised it's past 1 o'clock, Mis' Pettibone. When the whistles blowed for the third time I come in th' hall, but you was both busy with your talk. So I jest helped m'self to whatever I c'd find, bein' kind o' worn out with th' rubbin'. The teapot's on th' stove, an' I left a piece o' pie fer you." But Mrs. Pettibone did not at once avail herself of Mrs. Wessel's kindness. Instead, she went back into the minister's study and closed the door behind her. " I ought to be ashamed of myself," she said aloud to the silence, which seemed all at once tolerant of her weakness and kind to the point of forbearance. " I am ashamed." Having made her small confession thus, she took the picture from her blouse and slipped it back between the leaves of the blotter. " If you are alive," she whispered, " and can see, perhaps you will understand." Chapter 21 of The Heart of Philura, by Florence Morse Kingsley. Chapter 21 The Confession. The minister came home from the funeral that afternoon rather earlier than he expected. Rufus, he stated, referring to the sorrel horse, had travelled well on the way home. Mrs. Pettibone recalled that it was the habit of Rufus to travel well when headed toward his manger. " I hope," said the minister, looking narrowly at her, " you haven't been working too hard during my absence." " Oh, no," denied Mrs. Pettibone, casting down her eyes. " There wasn't much to do." From his ignorant masculine viewpoint there was never much to do in the parsonage. How could there be, with only the two of them? Nevertheless, he continued to gaze at her, a puzzled look in his kindly eyes. " Has any one been here? " he asked. Mrs. Pettibone appeared to reflect, her eyes still avoiding his. " Yes," she said, with visible reluctance. " That young woman from the Eggleston house." " Indeed! " cried the minister. " That is encouraging. I was hoping we might get some hold upon them. They seem rather unusual people." " Yes," murmured Mrs. Pettibone, " they are." She moved away from him, her thoughts centred determinedly upon the kitchen. " You must be hungry," she said. " I'll have supper early." " Thank you, my dear. I believe I am, now that you speak of it." He turned abruptly toward his study. " I shall work on my sermon until you are ready." And he rumpled up his hair in the way she knew so well. She perceived that already he had forgotten the half formed questions in his mind. But seated at their modest supper table, he again referred to the matter. " Did you have a pleasant visit with that young person, Mrs. Hill? " he inquired, as he sprinkled his second baked potato with salt and inserted a very small lump of butter in its steaming interior. His wife did not answer, and after a pause he spoke again. " I recall the fact that we found the younger Mrs. Hill's personality rather uninteresting, didn't we? She seemed very young and rather sullen. That, at least, is the impression she made upon me." He glanced inquiringly across the table at Mrs. Pettibone, who was nervously crumbling a slice of bread beside her plate. She was not the sort of woman to crumble bread in so aimless and wasteful a manner. He continued to eye her with growing astonishment. " Did the young woman ask for me? " he inquired. " I am apt to be at home of a Saturday, but I don't recall mentioning the fact to the Hills." " Ought I to tell you? " The spot of colour in her cheek had deepened to scarlet. " Ought you to tell me? You are referring to Am I to understand that something of an unusual nature took place during my absence? I can think of no reason why you should not tell me everything." " I've been wondering," she said humbly, " whether I said the right thing. I didn't know at first. And one who has thought small, mean thoughts for so many years — I did, you know. I used to think God was a large, severe person, sitting up in the clouds somewhere and watching me, always displeased with what I did, and, yes, trying to think of some new way to make me unhappy. Of course I knew I deserved it." " You didn't tell her all that, my dear," demanded the minister, who had forgotten to eat his potato. "Oh, surely you didn't." "Oh, no. Oh, no, indeed. I said she must pray and believe, and that everything would come right. I said he was in the all-encircling good. I felt sure he was alive. I don't know why, but I did, and I told her so. But afterward, well, it came over me all of a sudden. If he should be dead, or if he was bad, as Mrs. Hill seemed to suppose. And one can't help thinking—" "Really, my dear," interrupted the minister, "I shall have to ask you to explain. I can make neither head nor tail of what you are telling me. Unless you explicitly promise the young person to say nothing to me, I conceive that I should be told at once of all that took place." Thus encouraged, she told him the substance of what had passed between her and the young woman from the old Eggleston farm. He listened in silence, his forehead knit in troubled thought. "If I told her what wasn't true," she said, "how terrible it would be. Perhaps I ought—" He looked across at her, a smile dawning in his eyes. "My dear," he said in a slow, deep voice, "could any facts, however disastrous, alter the nature of God?" She drew a half-sobbing breath. "Oh, I suppose not," she murmured. "But I told her, I led her to expect—" "'For thou wilt light my candle,'" he quoted. "'The Lord my God will enlighten my darkness.' We must believe that, my dear, if we let everything else go by the board." "Oh, you mean—" She looked at him humbly. "If our own candle is a light, and another comes to us in the dark—" Her face became suddenly illumined. "I see," she said. "It is like lighting a candle blown out in the wind. And one ought—" "Obviously," he said. "One can do no less." He lingered, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, a musing look upon his face, while she began removing the remnants of their meal. "Well, that explains something," he said, after a brief silence. "Something which disturbed me unreasonably. I had not intended speaking of it to you." She looked at him inquiringly. "I drove home to-night by way of the old Eggleston road, and as I rounded the corner by the big oak tree — you know the place — I came upon young Hill and Milly. They were talking earnestly, and as I passed I couldn't help noticing their faces." She uttered a slight exclamation of dismay. "The young fellow was flushed and eager — he's a handsome chap, by the way — and Milly had been crying, I think." "Oh, I hope not," breathed Mrs. Pettibone. Her face had once more taken on a look of poignant distress. "Oh, tut, tut," said the minister, smiling down at her. "How about the all-encircling good? Doesn't it embrace those two?" "You didn't think so till you knew," she retaliated. He sighed. "True," he acknowledged. "Oh, the body of this death and its cowardly carnal mind! Well, my dear, I'm not fit to write sermons, but it appears to be my job. If it wasn't for you, and your occasional clear seeing — you see, I'm not making you too perfect — but if it wasn't for you, Miss Philura, I'm afraid I should oftener miss the truth of things altogether." Unwisely, perhaps, she turned to face him, a wan little smile curving her tremulous lips. "You oughtn't to say that," she murmured, her voice shaken with the hard beating of her heart. "You wouldn't if you knew — everything about me." She tried to meet his gaze unflinchingly. But alas, Miss Philura had never quite mastered the gentle art of dissembling. Her voice broke piteously over the last word. He gazed at her in silence, while she made blind pretence of brushing imaginary crumbs from a spotless tablecloth. " I'm afraid you've been working too hard to day," he said, gently drawing her toward him. Come into the study, dear, and give an account of yourself." But at the threshold she drew back. "Oh, not there," she begged rather wildly. Oh, Silas, I've been deceiving you all these months." His face whitened slowly. Well, he had been afraid of it, had all along been conscious of something not well hidden in that transparent breast of hers. He led her, all shaken with sobs, to the shabby old sofa, and sat down at her side, but not touching her. God helping him, he would play the man. " Now," he said masterfully, " you'll tell me what this means. Don't be afraid, dear," he added, with a gentleness in which there was no touch of compulsion, but only a great weariness. " I shall understand." Already he had passed in swift review the months of their brief engagement, of their marriage. Too long she had lived the life of a cloistered nun, he was thinking, to bear his rude transplanting. He should have been satisfied with her friendship, which she would have poured out for him, drop by drop, with delicate frugality. But now " I cleaned your study," she began, her head hanging, all the colour gone out of her face. " You cleaned "" Your study? Yes. Oh, you asked me not to. You forbade me. But I did. I've done it ever so many times, and always when you were away. And I pretended — I was careful to arrange everything so you wouldn't know." He glanced about him with slow bewilderment. Nothing had been changed. The Simpkins commentary on the Pauline epistles lay just where he had left it the day before. On the writing table were the loose sheets of his unfinished sermon, and on the floor — "You cleaned?" he repeated dazedly. " Oh, hang the study! I don't care if you turn it inside out every day from now on. What I want to know is, why did you cry when I said I couldn't write sermons without you? " There was another matter, as he soon found out. Mrs. Pettibone, it is true, wiped her eyes and tried to smile her appreciation of the splendid generosity of his surrender on the question of the study. She assured him with touching earnestness that she wouldn't turn the room inside out every day, but only at stated intervals, and with the same care and attention with which she had guiltily deceived him in the past. " But you haven't answered my question," he persisted, turning her small face up to his and looking deep into her eyes. " There's something else. You must tell me what it is." She was mute under his inquisitorial gaze, trembling a little, but not attempting to look away. " Tell me," he begged, " as you hope for our happiness." Thus adjured, she began in a small, faint voice. " Well, one day, a long time ago, I took everything off your writing table." " Yes," he said, a smile creeping about the corners of his lips. " You have already confessed to that enormity." " I dusted your blotting pad." "Well?" he encouraged her. She drew a quick breath, gazing at him incredulously. " You didn't mean that I should see — I had no right "" To dust my blotting pad? Well, possibly not. But I hereby grant you the inclusive and exclusive right to " The look in her eyes stopped him. What? " he began. She arose and walked steadily to the writing table. He followed her in perplexed silence. " You didn't mean that I should see this," she said, and gave him the picture. A slight exclamation escaped him at sight of it, and then he stood quite still, looking at the pictured face. She was seeing it, too, the wistful mouth with its half smiling, half sad look of expectancy, the loose dark curl lying softly upon the whiteness of the graceful neck, the deep, questioning eyes. Presently he sighed. " You found this? " he said, looking up at last. It fell out when I put it back. I knew I had no right." Her voice trailed off in a minor key, infinitely touching in its hopeless appeal, and her shamed eyes begged his forgiveness. "No right?" he repeated gently. He put out his hand and led her back to the sofa. "My dear," he said, after a silence which somehow soothed and comforted her, "I loved Mary. She was beautiful, as you know, and I was hardly more than a boy when we were married. We were happy." He sighed, his eyes not now on the picture, but, as it seemed to her, breathing stilly at his side, afar off, intent upon some distant scene of a poignantly regretted past. He roused himself after a little and looked down at her questioningly. "Did you suppose I had hidden it?" he asked, with entire unexpectedness. "And that all this time I had been brooding over it, quite in secret? No, dear, I shall have to confess I didn't know it was there. Somebody, Mrs. Wessells no doubt, must have slipped it under the blotter long ago." A quaint, almost humorous smile touched his grave lips at sight of her awakening face. She stirred ever so little, the colour stealing back to cheeks and lips. "If you had," she murmured, "I should not have wondered, nor blamed you. She was so beautiful, and I—" He took her in his arms. "You are very dear," he whispered, "and I love you." Quite unnoticed, the photograph slipped to the floor and lay there, its dimmed loveliness face down upon the carpet. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of The Heart of Philura by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. A Rainy Dawn. "You must keep this door shut." Milly looked up inquiringly, and then she lowered her eyes, glancing sideways at the small, motionless bundle on the cot. "If the child cries," Mrs. Hill went on, in a slow, harsh voice, "the mother must not hear it. She's too ill at present." The two women were standing in a small room off the kitchen, the light of a rainy dawn upon their faces. "Shall I would you like me to go for a doctor?" stammered the girl. She stood twisting her fingers nervously, trembling a little after hours of dumb terror passed alone in the big kitchen. "I should have told you in the beginning that I was able to care for the case," Mrs. Hill said coldly. "If you were frightened, I am sorry. The child is healthy. It will sleep." Milly stole a swift glance at her mistress. Years appeared to have passed over her head during the night. The full, pale cheeks had fallen into longitudinal folds and wrinkles. There were purple pouches under the bloodshot eyes, and streaks of white in the smoothly brushed hair. "There was no time to call a physician," Mrs. Hill went on slowly. " You know that." Her eyes cajoled, then threatened. "The event was unexpected, but fortunately I have had experience. My daughter is perfectly safe. She will recover. You need feel no alarm." The girl's troubled glance again sought the cot, in the midst of which, with a singular effort of lonely isolation, lay the motionless little mound of blankets. "Well, would you like to see the child?" asked Mrs. Hill, her mouth twisting in a difficult smile. Milly's breast heaved. "If you please," she said huskily. Mrs. Hill moved toward the cot, and stood for an instant gazing somberly down at it. A lump in her broad, bare throat seemed to move a little. She bent down, drawing the blankets aside. " It's a fine, healthy child," she said dryly. " A boy." The girl gazed at the little head covered with dark down, at the tiny pink face with its closed lids, at the minute fists upheaved on either side. Something within her trembled, and the breath came from her parted lips in light, quick gasps. Mrs. Hill replaced the blankets, her large hands moving swiftly. " I'm going upstairs," she said. " I shall come down presently for the gruel. Don't burn it." Milly moved obediently toward the stove, still dazed and trembling before the unveiled mystery. " You must keep this door shut," the woman repeated sharply, " and all the doors between. Keep them closed. Do you hear? " Milly raised her eyes from a blind contemplation of the bubbling stuff in the saucepan. " If the baby cries," she murmured, " shall I? "" It will not cry. I shall attend to its wants myself. Do not come upstairs, and do not permit anyone to enter. Do not speak to anyone. The house must be kept quiet." Milly's lips parted, and she seemed about to ask another question. Mrs. Hill darted a quick, impatient glance at her. " Why am I forced to explain to you? " it seemed to say. " My son left early this morning," the toneless voice went on. " He will not return. We shall join him as soon as Mrs. Hill is able to travel." The door closed, and Milly, left to herself, stood for a long minute quite motionless in the middle of the large kitchen. A heavy silence seemed to have settled upon the house. Outside in the wet grass a cricket chirped disconsolately. A stealthy little wind crept about the eaves, whined eerily in the chimney, and then passed with a deep murmuring rustle into the dripping hemlocks which fringed the ruined garden. The girl pressed the back of both hands against her eyes, like a child in pain. Chapter 23 of The Heart of Philura by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23 Playing Mother. Philura Pettibone walked slowly between shorn meadows, where red clover was beginning to bloom as in early summer. She carried a basket on her arm filled with fresh eggs, the basket and the eggs furnishing a legitimate excuse for thus walking idly along the country road where there had been no dust these many days. Heavy rains had washed the landscape clean, and it now presented a shining morning face to the sky, where capricious winds drove the clouds in opposite directions. In the rare upper air small round white fleeces, like a flock of lambs, moved slowly westward, while beneath them detached masses of denser vapour sailed majestically out to sea, their shadows flitting over meadow and hill like the drag ropes of gigantic balloons. Mrs. Pettibone's face, under the brim of her shady hat, shone like the newly washed earth. She was as happy as a woman may be who feels herself beloved. And this, be it said, she needs must know afresh, today as well as yesterday, and likewise tomorrow, till winter comes, and with it night. But winter and night seemed very far away on this day when summer forgot that it was August. The woman, whose hair was already a little grey, sang under her breath as she walked along, a little chirping song about a robin in a tree. Then all at once she saw the children. There were 10 of them, perhaps, or even 15. They were so small and merry in their pink and blue frocks, and they ran about so fast, she found them hard to count as butterflies about a puddle. The largest child, a girl, spied the woman looking at them across the fence, her face rosy and wistful under the shady hat. " We can play in this meadow now," the girl said confidentially. " The hay has been cut, and there are no cows here. And today there's no school, 'cause our teacher's gone to a funeral." The girl's face shone with pure joy. She gazed at Mrs. Pettibone, her eyes sparkling under wind-blown hair. " That's very nice," the minister's wife assented, understandingly. " It was her grandmother," piped another child, as she danced up to the fence. " She was old, but now she's gone to heaven and we can play all day. I'm glad, aren't you? " Mrs. Pettibone nodded, her eyes very blue and bright, her cheeks pink with sudden longing. " If I might come in for a little while? " she murmured. The biggest girl regarded her doubtfully. " You're grown up," she objected. " But I can play." The girl glanced over her shoulder at the pink and blue frocks tumbling over one another in the grass. " Can you play Mother? " she asked. Mrs. Pettibone blushed up to the margin of her silvered curls. " Oh, yes," she said eagerly, " if you'll let me." " You'll have to climb over. We climbed over. We were going home, and our teacher said we must go home. But it's a pleasant day, and our mothers don't expect us for a long time yet, and the hay is all cut." Mrs. Pettibone climbed over. It wasn't a difficult feat, but first she pushed her basket through the rails. " What's in your basket? "" Eggs. But they're not cooked." The big girl turned her head. A number of the children had scampered to the fence and were staring at the intruder with sudden gravity, almost displeasure in their round faces. " She has eggs in her basket, but they're not cooked," explained the girl. " I said she might climb over. She can play Mother." The big girl spoke with a kindly but coercive authority. " I shall be one mother. You will be the other mother. My p'tend name is Mrs. Alphonso Smith. Alphonso is a beautiful name, don't you think so? Now, what'll your name be? "" Mrs. Silas Pettibone," submitted the woman in the blue gown. She was no taller than the big girl. " Do you think that's a good name for a mother? "" Oh, it'll do," pronounced the girl. " But Silas isn't as beautiful as Alphonso. Now, I shall have 6 children, and you can have 5. I think I'd better have the largest family, 'cause I'm more experienced. I spank my children when they're naughty. Do you? " Mrs. Pettibone considered. Then she shook her head. " No, I could never do that. I sing to my children and hold them in my lap." The girl cast a look of smiling scorn at her. " If that's the kind of mother you're going to be, I'll give you the littlest ones. I'll take the big ones. My mother says all children need spanking once in a while. We spank our dolls and our kitten regularly, don't we, Myra? " assented a small girl in a pink frock. " But I guess I'd rather be her little girl. I like to sit in laps and be singed to." " All right. Now I'll divide the children. Your name is Myra what d' you say your name was going to be? "" Pettibone," supplied the minister's wife. " Your name is Myra Pettibone, and your name is Hattie Smith, and yours is Jennie Pettibone, and yours Come here, Georgie. Do you want to be her little boy? You don't? Well, then, yours is Georgie Smith. I guess you'll have to have all the girls, Mrs. Pettibone. You don't care? " Mrs. Pettibone shook her head. " I don't care," she said, surveying her rapidly growing family with entire satisfaction. The 2 little girls had huddled close against her skirts and were staring truculently at the Smith family. " Ma! " whined the newly christened Myra, who was evidently acquainted with the rules of the game. " Georgie Smith is putting his tongue out to me." The big girl gazed sternly at the accused. " Georgie Smith! " she exclaimed. " Do that again, and see what you'll get. I'll tell your pa, sir, when he comes home t' night, that's what I'll do. Now, M'rie, you're Mrs. Pettibone's next to the youngest. She's a nice child, Mrs. Pettibone, and I'm going to give you Baby. I'd like to have Baby myself, she's so cunning. She doesn't go to school all the time, but her mother was canning raspberries today, so I brought her. Her real name is Louise Gwendolen, but everybody calls her Baby." Mrs. Pettibone held out her arms with a smile, and Mrs. Alphonso Smith gently propelled a chubby child of 3 into them. " Now, let me see. You've got Myra and Jennie and M'rie and Baby. Do you want another? " Mrs. Pettibone thought 4 would do. She was gazing rapturously at Louise Gwendolen, who had tucked her thumb into her rosy mouth with an air of drowsy content. " Well, if it ain't, you can have another just as well as not," promised Mrs. Alphonso Smith generously. " That makes me 7. She gazed with severe benevolence at the newly christened Smiths, who were cavorting joyously amid the clover. " I shall cut me a good strong switch, first thing I do," murmured Mrs. Smith, darkly. " 7's a big family for a little woman like me, Mis' Pettibone. More especial when their pa has gone to Boston for all day. Now, you must tell what your husband's doing." " My husband — I think he's writing a sermon," submitted Mrs. Pettibone, realistically cuddling her youngest. " A sermon? Is he a preacher man? " Mrs. Pettibone nodded, and Mrs. Alphonso Smith looked doubtful. " That's really and truly, ain't it? We're Hard Shell Baptists. That's the best kind, my father says." She tossed her head carelessly. " I don't know as I care. You c'n be a p'tend Presbyterian, if you want to. Now, your house is under that tree, an' your yard comes to here." She marked off an imaginary line with her toe. " My house is under this big tree, an' my yard is all that place over there. I'm goin' to take my children home an' put 'em straight to bed. An' you'd better, too. Then to morrow mornin' — we don't have night last long, 'cause they won't lie still — we'll give 'em breakfast. You can have 3 lunch baskets. I'll send one of my children over with them. You can p'tend he's a grocery man, if you want to. You pick the money off the bushes — nice green leaves — an' roll 'em up, so. Looks exactly like money. We can have all we want. It takes a lot of money, Mrs. Pettibone, to bring up 7 hearty children." Mrs. Alphonso Smith achieved a grown-up sigh. " I tell my husband every day of my life I don't see how I can make out. The children do wear their shoes out so. Now, you go in your house, and to morrow first thing I'll come and call and bring my 2 youngest children. And then in the afternoon — Georgie Smith, come here this minute. I'll have to spank you good before your pa comes home. Then what do you think he'll say? " Georgie Smith hung his head before the terrific possibilities he had doubtless realized in the not distant past. Experience taught him to say, " I wasn't doing nothin', Ma. Marg'ry, she pinched me." " Marg'ry Smith, did you pinch your little brother? You c'n come in the house and go straight to bed. You'll get no cake nor pie for your supper, Miss." Amid realistic howls of grief she turned to the less experienced matron. " You'd better take your children right home, Mrs. Pettibone. P'raps you didn't know it, but there's whooping cough 'round this neighbourhood. I thought I ought to tell you. My children have all had it, but yours haven't." Mrs. Pettibone hastily withdrew with her flock to the spot kindly pointed out by Mrs. Alphonso Smith. " Up in a tree, robin I see, pecking them one by one," she crooned. Baby was really and truly sleepy. She crept into her pretend mother's lap and pillowed her curly head comfortably upon her breast. Her little body was soft and warm, and one could hear her sucking her thumb. Gentle thrills of rapture crept over the pretend mother. " Cherries are ripe, cherries are ripe, oh, give the baby one," she sang, and Myra and Jenny and Marie, resting their heads upon her skirt, shut their eyes, squeezing them tight against the bright sun rays that darted through the clustered oak leaves. " It's night," whispered Myra, " and we're in our cribs covered up snug and warm. I said my prayers. Did you, Marie? "" But you have to say your prayers to your mother," retorted Marie indignantly. " Not when you're pretending. You can pretend you said 'em to your mother. Let's hurry and go to sleep, so it'll be morning quicker." " We haven't had any supper. I want my supper 'fore I go to sleep. Mother, I'm hungry. I want my supper." " Hush, my babe, lie still and slumber," sang the pretend mother tenderly. " Holy angels guard thy bed." " You lie still, M'rie Pettibone," counseled Myra energetically. " Don't you see she's playing we've had our supper? Anyway, the grocery man didn't come yet. Mebbe Georgie's got into the baskets. He'd really and truly eat up all the cake if he did." At this awful suggestion the three little girls sat up straight, winking the sun from their eyes. " It's morning, Mother, it's morning. Don't you see how bright the sun shines? And we're hungry. Can we have our breakfast? "" Oh, you'll have to go to the grocery, children," Mrs. Pettibone smiled over the top of Baby's curly head. " Here's the money. Buy anything you want." " Just see all the money our mother's got. I'm the oldest. I shall carry the money and buy the things. You're not the oldest. I shall buy the breakfast. I was 7 last May. And I was 7 just last week. I am so the oldest. So there." The sound of a slap vigorously dealt, followed by really and truly crying, brought Mrs. Alphonso Smith to the scene. She separated the combatants with a practised hand. " That's what you get from being too good to your children," she explained to the perturbed Mrs. Pettibone. " You want to take 'em right in the beginning and give 'em somethin' to cry for. What are you quarrelling about, children? If your own mother can't manage you, the neighbours '11 have to come in and help. You're both 7? Of course you are. You're twins. Didn't you know that? I forgot to tell you. But you are. You can both carry the money, and you can both bring home the groceries. And if I hear you cry again, Jennie and Myra, unless it's pretend crying, you'll find your name changed to Smith all of a sudden. I got a good switch to my house, and 7 or 9 makes no difference to me. I'll take 'em any time you say, Mrs. Pettibone, and trade you Hattie for them. She's a good girl, and minds her mother." The hastily matched twins, amicably holding hands, trotted away under convoy of Mrs. Alphonso Smith. The third child, with a shrewd glance at the absorbed face of the pretend mother, followed. " She don't care as long as she's got Baby," she told the biggest girl. " She's a hugging and kissing Baby soft, like she was her really truly mother." " Oh, well," assented the resourceful Mrs. Alphonso Smith, " you can be my next to the youngest little girl, if you'd rather. And I'll take the twins, too. She can pretend she's got an only child. I'd just as soon have 10." The pretend mother under the oak tree was revelling in her dream. The delicious feel of the round, soft limbs, the silken mass of curls against her cheek, the warm breath coming and going between parted lips which resembled the half-closed bud of a pink rose, filled her with rapture. " My little baby," she whispered. " Mother's own precious little baby." The starved breast under the baby's warm cheek throbbed with the passionate beating of the heart beneath. There was no other woman near to regard her with half contemptuous eyes of wonder and pity. They were alone, these two, in the wide, sweet-smelling world, with bees in the red clover and the voices of meadowlarks calling and answering under the drifting clouds. How long she sat thus, folded in the warm happiness of that dream of motherhood, Philura Pettibone never knew. She was roused at last by a man's voice. " I beg your pardon, Ma'am. I asked the children playing in the road, and they couldn't tell me." She looked up, her eyes, from which the vision had not yet fled, as blue as cornflowers under the brim of her shady hat. " Oh, I'm afraid I've waked your baby," he apologized, with a smile. He seemed of a commanding height, viewed from her lowly seat under the tree. And now that the smile had faded from his young face, she saw that it was pale and anxious. " Can you tell me where a family called Hill — I believe they're strangers in the neighbourhood — are living? " The child slipped from her arms and, looking around the empty field with wide, startled eyes, began to cry piteously. " Oh, I am sorry," he repeated. " I seem to have frightened your baby. But you can tell her I will go at once." His face was oddly familiar, now that she looked at it more narrowly. Where had she seen those strongly marked brows and the stern curve of the young lips? He went away, when at length she had satisfied him with minute directions of a turn to the right, 2 to the left, a bridge to be crossed, and stone gate posts opposite a red barn. Her puzzled eyes followed him as he strode to the fence. He was in haste, whatever his name or his business. She walked home under the noonday sun, with a guilty sense of furniture undusted, a pudding which was to be and was not, and of a basket filled with mending, which ought on this particular day of the week to be empty. At the door she was met by her husband, his hair rumpled picturesquely upon his forehead, in a way which signified that work in the study had gone smoothly that morning. " How very nice you look, dear," he said, tilting her face all luminous with afterglow up to his. And he stooped to kiss her, though such was not his sober habit. " Oh, Silas," she murmured, blushing, " I should have been home long ago, but I came upon some children in a meadow." " Some children in a meadow," he repeated, when she showed no inclination to explain further. " That sounds pleasant. And you "" I climbed over the fence and played with them," she confessed, her eyes downcast before the quizzical smile in his. That afternoon, as with furtive dustcloth she was hurriedly attempting to make good the omissions of the morning, she beheld the majestic figure of Mrs. Buckthorn moving up the walk. " I just stopped in on my way to see poor Mrs. Pratt," began that lady, with a searching glance about the room. " What? You haven't heard she's had another of her spells? Yes, I know, she was about as usual yesterday. But in the afternoon, my, yes. I thought of course you'd heard, and Mr. Pettibone. They didn't send for him. I s'pose they was too busy doing for her. But they'll expect him to call. It's a pastor's duty and privilege, and he'd ought to know without being sent for where he's wanted." Mrs. Buckthorn drew a sibilant breath from the interior of her being, accompanied by a solemn creaking of her stays. " I don't know as you realize, Philura, that if you ain't careful and prayerful you might actually hinder the work that's being carried on in our midst, instead of helping it, as you'd ought to do. Did you ever think of that? " Mrs. Pettibone stole a guilty look at the spot where she had concealed the dustcloth behind a sofa pillow. Mrs. Buckthorn found her murmured reply far from satisfying. " I see you ain't," she observed in hollow tones. " I was afraid of it. I says t' th' deacon this mornin', ' It's borne in on me,' I says, ' that however painful, I ought to have a heart-to-heart talk with Philura Pettibone. No,' I says, ' don't try to hold me back. Philura was a scholar in my Sunday school class for many, many years,' I says, ' an' little I thought in them days, when his first wife was livin', that I should ever see her in the parsonage.' " Mrs. Pettibone's eyes, uplifted from a depressed contemplation of the dusty round of a chair, fell upon the picture of the Huguenot lovers on the opposite wall. A wandering sun ray, piercing the leafy mazes of a lilac bush just outside the window, flickered tremulously over the two young faces, forever wrapped in the sweet pain of that tragic parting. " Oh! " she murmured indistinctly, her thoughts bearing her far from Mrs. Buckthorn's massive presence and the droning sound of her intolerant voice. Had the stranger of the morning's encounter found the Eggleston farm, she wondered? And could it be " Faithful are the wounds of a friend," her visitor was reminding her acidly. " I s'pose likely you'd rather not think much about her, more especially since you can't hold a candle to her in looks. That's perfectly natural, I'm sure. We can't all be handsome, Philura, but we can all strive to do our duty." Chapter 24 of The Heart of Philura, by Florence Morse Kingsley. Chapter 24 Sylvia's Child. Morning of the next day, marked by no evasion of housewifely duty, found Mrs. Pettibone busy in the compounding of a certain cake, which her lord had once approved, and which called for the frugal outlay of but a single egg and a solitary spoonful of butter. As the egg whisk struck the bottom of the bowl in a brisk patter of sound, she became aware of a shuffling step outside, and glancing up, beheld Grandfather Orne apologetically wiping his feet on the door-mat. " Dunno as I'm s' to say muddy, ner yet dusty," he began, " but Gran'ma she got me trained so 'at I don't das' walk in on no floor without wipin'. ' I wonder ef there's door mats in heaven,' I says. But Gran'ma she says, ' No, them golden streets is kep' clean enough t' eat off,' she says. Yes, ma'am, I'll set down a minute, if you don't mind." The old man disposed himself in the wooden chair the minister's wife set for him, with considerable ceremony and a vast deal of clearing his throat. He had come to tell her something she knew, but, familiar with the ways of the countryside, she went on compounding the cake, her rapid spoon beating its staccato rhythm against the sides and bottom of the bowl. " Milly come down from th' farm this mornin'," chirped Grandfather, clutching his old straw hat with both heavy hands, as if he feared it would escape him. " Did she? "" Yes, mum. She come down bareheaded an' all out o' breath." The old man stared unwinkingly at the cake tin, into which the minister's wife was carefully pouring the yellow mixture. " Her Gran 'ma was some s'prised t' see her." " She must have been." " Seems the young lady's lit out unexpected." Mrs. Pettibone hastily set down her bowl. " The young lady? Do you mean —"" Her that was young Mis' Hill. Milly come down t' ask us did we see her a goin' by. I guess the's been some cur'us doin's up at th' farm. The young man, he went off a week ago, an' Milly 's been there all alone with 'em. We thought mebbe you didn't know. Somebody ought t' go up there. Gran 'ma, she says t' me, ' Go down an' tell th' minister's wife, Gran 'pa,' she says. So I dropped m' hoe an' come, jes' 's I was. Beats all how anybody c'd git right up out o' bed an' clear out so nobody c'd trace 'em." " Out of bed? " repeated the minister's wife dazedly. She walked across the floor and, quite without knowledge of what she did, opened the oven door and set her cake inside. " Well, mebbe she was settin' up. Milly, she wa'n't allowed t' do nothin' outside th' kitchen, so she couldn't say 's t' what was goin' on upstairs. But th' ol' lady, she was down in th' back room fer quite a spell this mornin', doin' fer th' baby, an' it must 'a' been while she was gone that th' young lady "" What? Did you say there was a baby? " inquired Mrs. Pettibone. The face she turned upon the old man was pink with excitement. Her hands gripped her apron. " Why, yes, mum, when she was washin' an' dressin' it, mebbe. Milly says it's an awful cute baby. It's 'bout a week old, I should say. You hadn't heard of it, ma'am? Well, I guess nobody had. 'Twas kep' kind o' quiet. Even Gran 'ma, she didn't know till she went up t' see what 'd become o' Milly. Gran 'ma, she's a great hand to fret an' worry, an' them folks up there " Grandfather Orne moved uneasily in his chair. " I heard Milly a tellin' her Gran 'ma the baby 'd never been took upstairs." He shuffled to his feet and gazed frowningly into the crown of his hat. " Ef I was you, ma'am, I dunno but what I'd go up there an' kind o' look th' situation over, bein' as you're th' minister's wife. Milly, she don't seem t' feel real easy in her mind. An' her Gran 'ma — well, ma'am, you know what kind of a critter Gran 'ma is, always a worritin' an' champin' on a bit. An' 'tis queer fer a sick lady to " But the mistress of the kitchen had disappeared. He heard the quick tread of her feet in the room beyond, a door opening and shutting, and the sound of voices. " Seems kind of excited," mused Mr. Orne. " Well, let a man say the word ' baby ' t' most any woman, an' she'll fly 'round like a turkey on a hot rock." He moved slowly toward the door, his mouth twisted in a dubious smile. " Curious critters, women folks," he muttered. " The older I get, the more they seem that a way t' me. Onreasonable, as a rule, an' brash. And with this, his errand having been accomplished, Grandfather Orne returned to the cultivation of his late vegetables, which had been so suddenly interrupted by the unlooked-for apparition of his granddaughter. Late vegetables, such as cabbages and beets, set in solid, respectable phalanxes, soothed his aged nerves. One could depend on them in a world of chance and change, wherein womenfolk abounded, and where unexpected and, for the most part, disagreeable things were always happening. A cabbage, he reflected vaguely, was always a cabbage. Round, green, or purple, as the case might be, unperturbable. One might say anything to a cabbage, and one frequently did, without a resultant tremor of a cool, crisp leaf. The Reverend Silas Pettibone, having listened attentively to his wife's agitated interpretation of Grandfather Orne's message, laid down his pen without a protest, but he was far from following the rapid flight of her imagination. " You tell me a man asked you yesterday to direct him to the old Eggleston place. Has it occurred to you that he might have been a sewing machine agent, and therefore not at all connected with the disappearance of "" Oh, Silas! " protested his wife. " A sewing machine agent! He was young, tall, and very good looking." The minister smiled and rumpled his hair controversially. " I will harness the horse," he said. " But I cannot forbear reminding you, my dear, that sewing machine agents are quite as likely to be young, tall, and good looking as other men. More so, in fact. The occupation, it would seem, appeals to youth, and youth —" But she had already hurried away to put on her hat. As he urged the indignant sorrel horse along the road as rapidly as the animal's outraged feelings would permit, Mr. Pettibone was inwardly perturbed by the look on his wife's face. He had seen it there before, but being, despite his calling, imperfectly acquainted with the heart of woman, he did not recognize it for what it was. " You shouldn't worry too much about the young woman," he offered. " She might, have wandered out into the woods for an airing, and turned up long ago, quite safe, and none the worse " She shot him a pitying look. " I'm not thinking about her," she said. " What then? " Mrs. Pettibone's hands in their much mended lisle thread gloves closed tightly upon each other. " If there is a baby," she murmured tremulously. " That appears to be an incontrovertible premise," he admitted. " And if she didn't know My dear Philura," he smiled, " what an extraordinary imagination you're developing of late." He patted the tense little hand nearest him, very kindly but firmly, as if in his judgment the process of which he had spoken would better cease. " If she's gone — without knowing " persisted Mrs. Pettibone, not appearing to notice the veiled protest. He spoke sharply to the horse, who had taken advantage of the conversation to relax into a shambling gait, expressive of his sentiments toward his master and the world at large, which he appeared to view with equine displeasure. " Do you want me to go in? " he asked, as he presently assisted her to alight before the old Eggleston house. " Or do you prefer " She was silent for a moment, looking timidly up at the shuttered windows. " I don't know," she said at last. " Perhaps she — perhaps I "" Precisely," assented the minister, with an air of relief. " Go in at once. Milly will admit you. I've got a book with me. If you should want me " She took 2 steps toward the sombre old house, then suddenly turned, her face luminous but strangely pale. " Please kiss me," she said. " My dear," he protested, " if anyone should be looking " But he stooped and his lips touched hers. " There's nothing to be afraid of," he said, with a touch of masculine impatience. " I will go in, if you prefer." But already she had moved away from him, a little sob in her throat. Overhead the wind passed through the evergreens with a solemn murmur. No one answered her light rap at the side entrance, and after a moment of indecision the minister's wife passed around to the kitchen. The door stood open, but Milly was not there. On the shelf over the well-polished cooking range, the loud-voiced clock buzzingly told the hour of 4. There were flowers in a glass on the table, and a small rocking-chair stood near the window. Something white hung over the back of the chair, her eyes fastened upon it. Then she stepped inside, her feet making no sound on the painted floor, where the sun lay in warm pools of yellow light. Slowly she moved across the space which separated her from the chair. To the left of the stove a second door stood part way open. She reached out a timid hand to touch the little garment on the back of the chair. It was made of flannel, and there was lace about the scalloped hem. It was very quiet in the kitchen. The loud ticking of the clock beat hard against the silence. Somewhere, a great way off, a cock crew thrice, and the distant hoot of a locomotive whistle echoed lonesomely among the hills. Mrs. Pettibone held the little garment in both hands, pressing it against her cheek. The sun had rested upon it, and it was warm and soft. The faint, sweet smell of the wool was in her nostrils. Then all at once a sound broke the clock-ridden silence. Some young creature was awake and stirring in the next room. Philura Pettibone boldly pushed the door open and looked in. It was a small room, used perhaps as a servant's bedroom in the days when the Egglestons were a large and prosperous family. The walls, hung with defaced and dingy paper of a greenish hue, showed great splotches where the damp and mould had crept through the plaster. There was a single window, covered with a flimsy shade. In one corner stood a chest of drawers topped by a cracked mirror, and against the further wall a cot, its cheap blue and white striped mattress imperfectly concealed by a folded blanket. In the midst of the blanket, a little mound of something white stirred feebly with a half-smothered cry. It was perhaps half an hour later. Philura Pettibone never knew, since happiness takes no note of time. She was sitting in the rocking-chair, swaying gently back and forth, her arms closed about the baby, her down-dropped eyes intent upon the downy head against her breast. The woman who had noiselessly opened a door from behind stood motionless, staring at her contemplatively from under gathered brows. Then, as if resolved upon a course of action, she came briskly forward, a determined smile upon her lips. " Mrs. Pettibone," she said, " I didn't know you were here." The minister's wife looked up. Oh, perhaps," she said doubtfully, " I oughtn't to have taken it up." The bleak smile on the other woman's lips faded. " It doesn't matter," she said, looking at the child with a strange, intent expression. " It doesn't matter," she repeated, with a touch of impatience. She sat down, her back to the window. " I'm glad, on the whole, that you came," she said, after a heavy pause. " I had made up my mind to send for you. I am obliged at last to ask counsel of some one. You or your husband will do as well as another." " Mr. Pettibone is outside," recollected Mrs. Pettibone. " Shall I — would you prefer "" No. Sit still." She moistened her lips furtively. " I sent Milly to the village with a telegram. It seemed necessary to recall my son, much as I dislike doing so." The child in Mrs. Pettibone's arms stirred and began sucking its fist with little whimpering cries. " Do you think it's hungry? " she asked timidly. " Of course I know very little about babies, but "" The child is a boy," Mrs. Hill said, harshly. " He's not hungry. Give him to me. I'll put him back on the cot. If he cries it won't harm him." She took the baby and walked quickly to the ugly little room. Mrs. Pettibone stood gazing at her broad, stooped back and the jerky movement of her elbows as she rearranged the blankets on the cot. The baby continued to cry feebly. Mrs. Hill, turning suddenly, surprised a look of poignant distress, almost of anger, on the watchful face. She shut the door firmly behind her. " I think we will go into the other room," she said. " We shall not be disturbed there." She held the door to the dining-room wide, motioning the other woman to pass in before her. But Mrs. Pettibone drew back protestingly. " He might cry," she murmured, " and we couldn't hear him." Mrs. Hill's lips curled impatiently. " Please go in," she said peremptorily. " I have several things to tell you, and you must pay attention or you'll be of no use to me. It will do the child no harm to cry for a while." She closed the second door with decision and motioned her visitor to a chair. " My daughter " Her face quivered for an instant, then settled into iron composure. " The child was born 10 days ago. My daughter made a good recovery. Yesterday she was fully dressed for the first time. We expected to leave this place next week. But " The minister's wife appeared to be listening, as if intent upon a distant sound. She spoke without premeditation. " Don't you think she may have gone with her husband? " she asked. Mrs. Hill started violently. " With her husband? " she repeated, sharply. " Why should she go with her husband without my knowledge? We expected — Haven't I already told you that my son " She paused to look piercingly at Mrs. Pettibone. " What have you heard? " she asked, sharply. " She came to see me." "Well?" " She told me — about her marriage. She was very unhappy." " I don't understand. How "" Your son brought her to the parsonage," said Mrs. Pettibone, speaking slowly and distinctly. " They came in a carriage — about 2 weeks ago. You didn't know it? " The woman's dry lips formed the word " No." After a moment she shrugged her shoulders, her dull eyes moving slowly upward to the ceiling, where they appeared to fasten upon the movements of a fly crawling slowly about some ornate excrescence of discoloured plaster. " There was no use. I might have known. She was always stubborn and disobedient. I tried to save her. God knows I tried." " I think you were trying to save yourself," said the minister's wife, with one of those sudden flashes of insight which occasionally visit the least discerning of women. Mrs. Hill looked at her visitor, a dull flush rising in her sallow cheeks. " You think — What do you know about me — about any of us? How dare you say such a thing? "" Because you are hard and cruel. You didn't believe anything she said. You thought your own child lied to you. You believed she was wicked, when she was only " Mrs. Hill flung up her hand in a sudden reckless gesture. " Stop! " she ordered. " You heard Sylvia's version of the matter. Now listen to mine." But she was silent for a long minute, during which Mrs. Pettibone appeared to listen intently for some distant sound, her hands gripped in her lap. " I don't know why I should tell you anything," Mrs. Hill resumed, in a bitter tone. " You appear to have mixed yourself up in our affairs from the beginning. Doubtless you assume that your position as the wife of a clergyman entitles you — to meddle." Mrs. Pettibone rose, trembling, to her feet. " The baby is crying," she said. " I cannot listen to you while the poor little thing is left alone in that room. It is cruel — abominable." Her voice shook. There was in her face at that moment all the blind, unreasoning fury of thwarted motherhood. Mrs. Hill watched her visitor without apparent emotion as she hurried from the room. When presently she returned, the small flannel bundle hugged awkwardly to her breast, a faint flicker of amusement passed over her rigid face. " You seem fond of infants," she commented coldly. " Yes," said Mrs. Pettibone, gazing defiantly at her from behind the rampart of flannel. " I am. I love them." She patted the baby's back, as women will, crooning over the downy little head. " Fond," pronounced Mrs. Hill, curtly, in the silly, ignorant way common to animals and some women. " Sit down, if you will, and listen to what I have to say to you." Mrs. Pettibone obeyed. The child had ceased its feeble wailing and lay quiet in her arms. I can look back from this point and see that I ruined Sylvia's disposition with over-indulgence," pursued Mrs. Hill with iron composure. "All this," she appeared to include the shabby room, Mrs. Pettibone, and the child in a gesture of disparagement, "is doubtless the result of my own mistaken kindness to a child of a singularly passionate and uncontrolled nature. I should have been more severe. I should have insisted upon more implicit obedience. Realizing this, I have tried." Her voice, cold and monotonous, suddenly choked. Mrs. Pettibone looked up from her rapt contemplation of the baby's unconscious face. "You tried?" she repeated wonderingly. Mrs. Hill's solid, erect figure appeared to grow larger, more substantial still. She shot a glance of impatient contempt at the minister's wife. "My husband died when both of my children were young," she resumed, "leaving me with a considerable fortune. Our position in the world was unquestioned, our social prominence — but why speak of this to you? It is impossible for a woman like you to understand in any degree the problem that faced me when Sylvia — my God, what a frightful discovery!" The woman's large hands, of a yellowish-white colour, gripped the arms of her chair. " She told you she was married? " faltered Mrs. Pettibone. " Married? She had no proof, not even a ring. And the wretch had disappeared." " Did you — you knew him? " Mrs. Hill was staring at the child, who had again commenced its feeble wailing. " Sylvia was a mere child, a schoolgirl," she said harshly. " I employed a governess to instruct her in French and music. The woman connived at the acquaintance, kept it a secret from me. The man was a poor clerk, or something of the sort. I knew nothing of him, never saw him. He was not of our world. I was, of course, much occupied with social and charitable work. It never occurred to me that Sylvia — I had intended taking her to Europe this summer. We were only waiting for my son's graduation, when I — learned the facts." Mrs. Pettibone shifted the child's position in her arms with anxious tenderness. " But when you — when she told you, why didn't you try? "" Not being totally devoid of common sense, as you appear to think, I did all that could be done without making an open scandal. I had my son to think of, the honour of the family name. There was no existing proof of the marriage. Sylvia's account of it was utterly unbelievable. What could I do? What would you have done? " Her tone was bitterly sarcastic. " I should have loved her — all the time," breathed the minister's wife. " You might have done that. You might "" I am not," Mrs. Hill said, coldly, " a sentimentalist. I have always detested that sort of thing." " Yet you have children." The eyes of the two women met, like the blades of unsheathed rapiers. For an instant neither spoke. " You ought," said Philura Pettibone slowly, " you ought to have loved your daughter, before she was born and afterwards, every minute." Mrs. Hill's large shoulders moved slightly. " Really," she said, " I think we have quite lost sight of the matter in hand. I had no intention of asking your opinion of my character or conduct. I wished merely to inquire if you can give me the name and address of a trustworthy woman to care for the child. My daughter has left me of her own free will. I shall not trouble myself further concerning her future." " How could she leave her baby? " murmured Mrs. Pettibone. " It's that I don't understand." The woman's face changed subtly. She supposed it was dead. " You told her so? "" I allowed her to think so. It seemed best." Mrs. Pettibone looked at the large pale face, in which the events of the summer had graven ineradicable lines, and a great pity took possession of her. " Forgive me," she stammered. didn't understand." "You didn't understand," repeated Mrs. Hill, dully. "No." She stared at the wall, as if she saw written there words of judgment and of doom. "If I—" the minister's wife half whispered the words. "If you could trust me—" The opaque eyes came slowly back, with a look of weary incredulity. "You want the child? Impossible!" "Why impossible? I would take good care of him. And I would love him. But your husband's position! He would not consent. I should not, were I in his place. Think of the scandal! No, I'll take the child away with me. It has been ailing, and will perhaps not survive. Better so." A low cry of protest broke from Philura Pettibone's lips. She spoke wildly, eagerly, scarce knowing what she said. Mrs. Hill listened, her fingers picking at the folds of her dress in painful bewilderment. "You tell me a man came to take Sylvia away? Oh, stop! I do not follow you. What's this about a picture, and someone who spoke to you of us?" "It was her husband. I'm sure of it. He looked like the picture. She wrote to him, and he must have come. And if she thought her baby was dead, there was nothing — forgive me for saying it — but can't you see she must have feared and dreaded you after all that had happened?" Mrs. Hill drew a deep breath, and a faint colour stole into her face. "If, as you say, the father of her child found out where she was, and — but why did he not come to me? If he could show me proof of the marriage. No, I cannot believe it. She may be dead." Ghastly fear peered for an instant out of her distended eyes. "After I missed her, I went to the little pool in the woods. I thought — but she wasn't strong enough to walk so far." "The man," said Mrs. Pettibone positively, "was driving a fast horse. I noticed it particularly." It was at this moment that both women became conscious of a discreet knock on the outside door. Chapter 25 of The Heart of Philura by Florence Morse Kingsley. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25 Unto Us a Son is Born. The minister glanced doubtfully from one to the other of the two women, whose faces had instantly resumed the masks habitually worn before men. Mrs. Pettibone smiled faintly at her husband. "I was holding the baby," she explained. "I didn't realize how late it was." "Your wife," Mrs. Hill said dryly, "appears fond of children." "Murmured Mr. Pettibone, passing his hand over his chin. For a moment all three were silent. The infant struggled feebly in its wrappings with half-strangled cries. "You had better give it to me," Mrs. Hill said impassively. She rose from her chair and crossed the room. Mrs. Pettibone gazed at her imploringly, sheltering the baby with her arms. The minister, who had been consulting his watch, snapped its old-fashioned hunting case shut with suggestive emphasis. "Come, my dear," he said, with attempted jocularity. "You mustn't try to keep a baby from its grandmother, you know." Mrs. Hill straightened herself with a jerk, her angry eyes denying his words. "Silas!" He turned at the sound of his wife's voice, doubtfully interpreting its passion of entreaty. "We really oughtn't to stay longer," he said. "Mrs. Hill is perhaps —"" Come and look at the baby," she urged. He obeyed, gazing down at the small, pink, twisting face with a quasi-professional air of interest. " Ah," he murmured, " a fine child. Boy or girl? "" He's a boy, Silas," Mrs. Pettibone replied, looking up at him piteously. " Will you let me — Silas, Mrs. Hill is obliged to go away at once. To search for her daughter. She wants to leave the baby, and I... Oh, Silas. Impossible, broke in Mrs. Hill's harsh monotone. I've changed my mind. I shall take the child with me. You don't want it. You don't love it. You're wishing it would die. Philura Pettibone's voice rang out in a shrill crescendo. She stared accusingly at the other woman. You would soon kill it, with hatred and neglect. My dear Philura, expostulated the minister, shocked and incredulous. Surely you do not mean... He gazed attentively at his wife, the tardy realization that he had never known her slowly taking possession of him. Mrs. Hill laughed mirthlessly. You make me little better than a murderer, she exclaimed contemptuously. I assure you, I couldn't have taken better care of the child if it had been... She bit her lip sharply. Oh, you will let me have the baby, begged the minister's wife, suddenly abandoning her threatening tone. I must have it. I must. You know it'll only be a hindrance to you. How can you travel? And your son? You must think of him, you know. Mrs. Hill glanced stealthily at the minister, who had moved toward the door, his grave face perplexed and frowning. How do you like the idea of adding a misbegotten child to your family? She asked jeeringly. Clergymen are always preaching charity and goodwill, but I've never known one who practiced it. It is true, I do not want the child. God knows I have small cause for loving it. But I should not kill it with either kindness or neglect. Then I shall have him. Philura Pettibone rose from her chair, her face pale and luminous, like that of a woman newly emerged from the valley of the shadow into which every mother must needs descend. Without further word, she slowly passed out of the room, bearing the child in her arms. The two who were left behind heard the light sound of her feet upon the gravel, and the cries of the child, growing fainter with distance. I will pay liberally for its keep, of course, should you consent to the arrangement, Mrs. Hill said haughtily. I must explain further that I requested your wife to recommend to me some honest farmer's wife. I did intend to leave the child. It is nothing to me. Mr. Pettibone gazed at her with stern rebuke. You are a sinful woman, he pronounced slowly. Without love, a child is also without hope in the world. We will take him and endeavour to bring him up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Oh, but I must insist upon paying you. I am rich. The minister repelled her with a gesture of dignified authority. Your money perish with you, he exclaimed, with a severity before which the woman shrank as from the sharp cut of a whip. Milly Orne, returning from the village with anxious haste, met the minister's carriage at the bend of the road. At the sight of its occupants she stopped short, her eyes fastened upon the baby in Mrs. Pettibone's arms. " Oh! " she cried sharply. " You've been there. You... " The minister pulled up the impatient horse. " Yes," he began doubtfully. " Perhaps we've acted unwisely, but... " He glanced at his wife's pale face. " I've taken him for my own," she said simply, and her smile was sublime. Milly shook her head compassionately. " He has cried almost constantly for several days," she said. " I'm afraid "" And you were there? " murmured Mrs. Pettibone accusingly. " She locked the door," returned Milly, her blue eyes filling with tears. " Indeed, I could do nothing. But I am glad you are taking him away." Left to herself, the girl's feet moved more and more slowly along the road. She appeared to be debating some doubtful question with herself. Arrived at length before the stately gate-post, which marked a former pride of ownership, she paused to look half fearfully at the clustered chimneys of the old house, gravely withdrawn behind its ancient trees. The woman whom she had grown to fear and distrust, almost to hate in these, the last days of her service, was there alone, she knew. Already she had decided that she could not pass another night under that roof. But there was something she must say to Mrs. Hill before they parted as mistress and maid. She found the woman in the little room off the kitchen, engaged in packing the small belongings of the baby in a flat parcel. She glanced up sharply at the sound of Milly's step. " Did you send the message? " she asked. Milly nodded, her eyes following the swift movements of the large, pale hands. " I'm packing these things," explained Mrs. Hill. " To-morrow you're to take them to the village. I've arranged with the clergyman's wife to care for the child. She's one of those silly creatures who pretend to adore children." The girl stood silent, her hands hanging at her side. Mrs. Hill noted her attitude with one of her darting glances. " Why do you stand there like that? " she demanded. " Take off your hat and get me some tea at once. It's late." Milly lifted her eyes to the clock, which was now on the stroke of 6. " I'm going now," she said in a low, half frightened voice. " You will not need me." " Going? " echoed Mrs. Hill, sharply. " Indeed you are not. I shall need you for several days yet. Do you think I shall have nothing to do? There's the packing." " I'm going now," repeated Milly, doggedly. " I shall not stay here any longer." The woman stared at her angrily. " Take off your hat at once," she ordered, stamping her foot. " There's something I must tell you before I go. You may like to hear it," Milly said in her determined voice. She paused, perhaps to choose her words with care. But when she finally spoke, it was as though she had loaded a gun with hard, merciless phrases and fired them at a target with swift precision. " I know what became of your daughter. She went away with a man. I saw him." " You saw? What do you mean? " Mrs. Hill sank limply into a chair, as if the words had actually penetrated her large breast, inflicting mortal injury. She stared up at the girl with something like entreaty in her dull eyes. " I was at the front of the house, sweeping the passage," Milly went on. " You were dressing the baby, and all the doors were shut between, as you told me." " Yes, go on." " A man, driving a light buggy, came up the road. He spoke to me, asked me if a family named Hill lived in the house. I told him yes, and asked if I should call you. And just then a shutter in the room up above was thrown open, and the man looked up, and your daughter was leaning across the sill. She didn't speak at first, just looked. He held out his arms to her. ' I've found you at last,' he said." " Well? " commented the woman, hoarsely. " What then? "" I suppose she must have gone away with him," Milly said, lowering her eyes. " You suppose? Don't you know? "" I came in directly. I didn't like to look after that." " Why didn't you tell me? " Milly looked at her mistress defiantly. She did not answer. " If you'd told me, perhaps " Milly moved toward the back door. On the threshold she paused to glance back. The woman was sitting motionless, a small folded garment in her lap, her eyes staring straight before her into vacancy. Chapter 26